Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the organizers here at CTO Craft, and to each of you for spending the time with me today to explore fairness in hiring. I was about to do a brief intro for myself, but I think that pretty much covers it. I'll just add a couple of notes. So I'm Mike Boufford, I'm the CTO of Greenhouse, and the reason that I kind of thought that this was a good talk for me to give, I've hired hundreds of engineers and other folks over the years. And I've been at the center of hiring best practices for the past decade or so. So I felt that I was uniquely positioned to give this talk. It's also an important thing for us to be discussing. Fairness in hiring is determined by the hiring managers and by the recruiters and the companies. What behaviors we accept become what the market. It's a big responsibility for all of us. So. Sorry about that. Let's move on here. Just getting used to the slide system. By the end of this talk, I hope that you walk away with a deeper understanding of fairness in general and a few things that you can do to bake fairness into the hiring process. So this talk's going to be something like half philosophy and half practical, but let's start with something fun. So prepare your head. I'm going to make you think for about 5 minutes. So drink some tea, splash cold brew on your face. We're going to talk about fairness through the lens of game rules. So let's talk about our first game. Fairness game number 1, accumulating power. So in this game, the objective is to accumulate more than half of all the tokens. There will be 3 rounds played. So in round 1, all players start with just 1 token. In round 2, all players start with half of their tokens earned during the prior game. And round 3, all players start with half of their tokens earned during the prior game. So round 1 certainly feels fair, and by fair in this sense, I mean equitable. As a player in the game, round 2 starts to feel less fair because the prior winner's edge makes it much more likely that they will win. By round 3, if you hadn't accumulated enough tokens in prior games, you enter the game knowing you are all but certain to lose. So the rules are consistent, they're equally applied to all players, but is this game fair? I'll just point out that this models the type of advantage and privilege that we accumulate over our lifetime. And society and many babies born into the world today are in round 3 of this game right now, and most are not born with a war chest of tokens. Next game. Equal pay, fair pay. So the objective of this game is to maximize profit for 100% employee-owned BizCorp. All players have equal experience, rank, and work the same hours, and all players own an equal share of the business. Blue players always produce $10 an hour of profit. Red players always produce 5, green players 1. So what's the fair division of profit among players? Would it be fair to divide profits proportionally based on performance? Would it be fair to divide profits equally among shareholders despite differences in their individual contributions to those profits? If we choose to split profits evenly, what happens to the business in a free market where blue players have the option to work for a company that has chosen to offer performance-based pay? Next game. 1,000 players. A large number, evenly distributed between red, blue, and green, are vying for 100 well-paying jobs, and all players have equal potential to pass the interview. However, the job requires a certificate to interview. 15% of blue players have a certificate, 21% for red, 35% for green. So how does this requirement affect outcomes for each of these players? Groups of players, let's see. All right, so there it is. As you can see, green players are far more likely to get the job than blue players applying at the top of the funnel. In the sense of consistent application of a rule for all players, this game is fair, but to create equal odds for red and blue players to be hired as for green, you'd need to start the game with 467 blue players, 333 red players, and 200 green players, not the even distribution that we started with. And these percentages represent real numbers for college graduation rates among several race-based demographic groups in the United States. Note how this one requirement, all other things being equal, result in wildly different outcomes for each group of players. So if it's not predictive of hiring success for a given role, is it fair to include this requirement? Last one, the most abstract, perhaps. The original position So this was a sort of an exercise created by a philosopher named John Rawls. So just to make sure there's appropriate attribution. Imagine we create a new society of 10,000 people with broad-based diversity, different abilities, different demographics, socioeconomic starting points, and your objective is to design all of the rules and norms by which society is governed. So you're you, but you haven't been born yet. I know your brain explodes. You could be born into any one of those 10,000 bodies. So you could be smart or not so smart, have exceptional or limited mobility. You could have a loving or abusive family, start rich, start poor, have dark skin or light, speak the native tongue or struggle to learn it. From the day you take your first breath, you might have won the genetic lottery or be fated to wrestle with a never-ending series of insurmountable challenges. So given that you have no idea who you'll be, how should society work? Should access to healthcare and education be equitable for all, better for some? If so, what traits should result in access to better healthcare or education? Should people of higher intelligence be paid more? Should there be a tax on wealth to avoid power accumulation? The reason this exercise is interesting is because it helps us to apply a more objective lens. It allows for us to both think selfishly, what will be best for me, and think about what's best for everyone at the same time. So does this lens change any of your beliefs about what is fair? Fairness is complex. We don't always mean the same thing when we talk about something being fair, as it depends a great deal on our subjective experience. So let's go one level deeper to break down fairness from this one monolithic sounding thing into the several different things we really mean when we say that's not fair. So what do you mean when you think of fairness in hiring? Do you mean consistent decision-making criteria? When we talk about fair process, we're usually talking about consistency. And to design a consistent process in hiring for a role, you want each candidate to go through the same evaluation. And to do this, we want to write some stuff down. What criteria need to be met for someone to be successful in the role? And how do we assess whether they meet those criteria? This process of structuring criteria and assessments is called structured interviewing. And it's a thing that my company brought to market as software in 2013. Structured interviewing is one of the only techniques shown in academic studies to be better than random at predicting hiring success. Everyone uses the same criteria, questions, and assessments, so it's repeatable and reliable. Certainly, it also makes hiring more fair than an inconsistent or capricious process, but is that enough to call the hiring process fair? What if we set criteria, like college degree, which produce outcomes that feel unfair, like we saw in our earlier fairness game, demonstrating disparate impact? The other way we tend to evaluate whether a process is fair is to look at whether we see equal outcomes. Demographics are interesting to look at in part because someone's race or gender is completely irrelevant to whether someone can effectively do a job. So if we're seeing differences in outcomes among different groups, might there be some other type of fairness at work, unfairness at work? Many times, yes, both implicit and explicit biases cause differences in demographic outcomes. How, as interviewers, we perceive differences in culture, communication style, and even physical appearance can trigger unconscious bias and produce disparate outcomes for different demographic groups. But on the flip side, we might see differences in outcomes due to some other factor that correlates strongly with a particular demographic. An example might be a job posting which attracts a large number of applicants without a valid work visa, bumping into a company policy to automatically reject those without a valid work visa. Here, we might see differences in outcomes by group, but the underlying reason could be legal compliance and not bias itself. Fair process and fair outcomes are often two different things. Fair process is about consistency within the process itself, and fair outcomes is about producing more consistent results. What feels fair or unfair is fundamentally subjective. In academia, definitions of fairness anchor on concepts like envy-freeness, where no other person with equal rights feels envious of another person's share. Obviously, if I come along and I give each of you $5, you don't feel envious of anyone else's receipt of the money. But let's look at subtly more interesting examples. We might offer two working arrangements for the same role chosen by an employee. You could work a 40-hour per week schedule at 100% pay, or a 32-hour per week schedule at 80% pay. Since both options are available and there's pay parity per hour worked, this might be considered NV-free, as long as it's up to the employee how much time they choose to commit to work. But now let's say that person working 32 hours per week is just better at their job and produces the same amount of output as the person working 40 hours per week in less time. Suddenly, the arrangement starts to feel unfair to the person being paid 80%. Even though they're paid the same per hour wage, they are not paid the same per unit of output. If they were paid per unit of output and not per hour, then the person working more hours may feel it's unfair that they are paid the same as someone else putting in less time. Let's look at another example. Another example is, let's say, two software engineers, and they have the same working hours, level of experience, level of productivity. One of them is working at Evil Corp, making $300,000 per year, and one is working for a nonprofit called Profit Schmofit, making $100,000, an organization trying to ensure access to medical services for the poor. It's possible, if not likely, that based on their individual values, both software engineers believe they're being paid fairly. But how could that be if Evil Corp pays 3 times as much? Well, the engineer at Profit Schmofit may well wake up every day with more than $200,000 of additional happiness, knowing that their efforts that day will make the world a better place. Fairness is about feeling that our share, relative to others, the whole thing, pay, mission, etc., is fair. And these examples highlight that fairness is a multidimensional problem with inherent complexities which frequently create tensions that are not possible to resolve, in the practical sense, fairly. Now, we spent a lot of time with our heads in the clouds talking about fairness philosophically. In this next section, let's start applying some of that thinking to the hiring process. This is a simplified view of the hiring funnel. Sourcing, this is where you find candidates. Screening, whittling down the pile. Interviewing, deeply assessing the specific skills someone needs to do the job. And an offer, hoping that they accept the job based on your proposed terms. In this next section, we'll look at each part of the funnel and talk through the types of design choices we make when hiring and the effects on both the fairness and equitability of those outcomes. All right, we'll start with sourcing. So what is sourcing? It's finding people willing to devote the time and effort to go through your interview process. This includes a lot of different things: job boards, agencies, how you market the role, events, cold outreach, referrals, internal job boards, and more. All of these present choices which affect how accessible your roles are. Who do you tell about the job, and who do you let apply? When I was hired at Greenhouse before it had a name or the first line of code was written, I was hired because someone I had worked for in the past had referred me. And that person knew about it because someone else had referred him. Like in many startups, despite being 10 years younger, I was remarkably like the founders. I was a white, college-educated Jewish man living in Manhattan, networked in the nascent New York startup ecosystem. And I got the job, and being totally honest, it was a life-altering opportunity. An opportunity that not everyone had equal access to because they never knew the opportunity existed. This story is repeated time and again in hiring, and we must be mindful that access issues reinforce existing inequities in our society. By this, I don't mean to say that referrals or any other sourcing strategy in particular is bad or intrinsically unfair, but if we do strive to build demographically diverse teams, we must ensure that a diverse group of people know about the job in the first place. So building a sourcing plan which strives for equal access across demographics is still a challenge, and it requires real work to ensure that a diverse mix of people learn about your job, apply, and are ultimately hired. When you're encouraging people to apply to a job, we get to choose who to invite to the party, along with the admission criteria. Many of the best candidates for your roles are not actively on the job hunt. They're passive. They're happy in their current role, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't be happier by taking your job. They must be engaged proactively in order to consider joining your company. And there's lots we could discuss under sourcing, but I'm going to shine some light on the hottest topic, at least in the US, which is diversity sourcing. So companies leverage specific job boards or agencies which focus on attracting talent that would add diversity to their teams. So this does mean that companies are using race and gender at scale as part of the selection criteria to invite someone to apply for a job, which can be an emotionally charged, ethical, and legal gray area. But let's pull the question to the abstract for a moment, referencing our fairness game from earlier. Is it fair to invite more green people than blue people to apply based on greenness or blueness? And what if more blue people are aware of the job than green people in the first place? And my intention is to create a more representative distribution of applicants. Trying to achieve a more representative distribution is the reason companies put so much emphasis on top of funnel diversity sourcing. By simply posting a role on a job board and waiting, recruiters will often see certain groups overrepresented and other groups underrepresented, and are trying to correct for this imbalance. With a diverse applicant pool, running a fair process makes it much more likely that the process itself will yield fair outcomes. All right, fair screening. So screening is the part of the hiring process where we whittle down the pile. We usually screen in phases: application review, assessments, phone screens. And the goal of the screening process is to ensure that the company is only investing time in interviewing those who are most likely to be hired into the role. As a candidate, if you stand no chance, it's better to get knocked out early. So how should we prioritize when there are too many applicants? There are jobs for which there are literally 1,000 people or more vying for the position. So to whittle down 1,000 people to just one requires filtering through people in stages. It's often true that at the very top of the funnel, where candidates apply, recruiting teams are often under-resourced to sort through all of the candidates one by one. They certainly don't have time to take a phone call with 1,000 people. So they make some judgments about which things make it more likely someone will be hired successfully into a role. Common criteria are what skills and experience they have, their tenure in previous jobs, the prestige of previous employers, recruiter gut feel. Some are assessed by a real human being, and some of these things might be assessed by AI or ML. Real human beings tend to make these judgments by reading resumes and trying to match keywords, and so do computers. They make judgments about the quality of the applicant based on paper proxies, like did they go to a top school or are they a job hopper? ML-based candidate ranking solutions intend to mimic the type of prioritization done by a real recruiter, but ranking is fraud. Most ML ranking today is black box. It's not obvious which features of an applicant's resume are used to provide the ranking. And famously, Amazon built a black box algorithm to mimic recruiter behavior without sufficient feature engineering, and it started showing a preference for men in engineering roles. This preference likely existed in how recruiters made decisions, and predicting what a recruiter would do accurately was likely how they measured success for the algorithm. That said, a set of undesirable behaviors turned into an algorithm has the potential to institutionalize unfairness at scale, so we should be very wary of ranking which lacks explainability. There's an act in the United States called the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and it's actually an interesting model as we think about how hiring might be regulated at some point in the future. So once upon a time, banks would build risk models, which took into account bad criteria like, does this person live in a zip code where defaults happen more frequently? This often meant that despite what might be a perfect individual credit track record, a consumer might be denied access to credit based on criteria which correlated with default, like living in a low-income neighborhood. To avoid this type of issue, the FCRA was created to require that if a credit line is denied, the bank provide the underlying reason behind the denial. If you've ever been rejected for a credit card, it might have said something like not enough credit history or late payment 90 days. For other consequential decisions like hiring decisions, this remains largely unregulated and up to the company's discretion. Most candidates never find out why they were rejected and receive a generic form letter, or worse, no response at all. A fair screening process uses explicit and explainable criteria, just like in structured interviewing, to ensure consistent and fair treatment of candidates. This should be true with or without AI/ML in the mix. There are regulations which try to ensure protected classes are not discriminated against, but they don't go as far as the FCRA in trying to ensure all hiring decisions are made using criteria that are fair. Now let's get into the meat. Fair interviews. So while screening was about saving time assessing people who were unlikely to get the job, interviewing is about deeply understanding how well the candidate can do the job and collaborate with their team. Ultimately, there may be a bunch of people we find are qualified at the end of the process, but may still be forced to whittle down the pile again to the one, the candidate we ultimately hire. And earlier in this talk, we spoke about consistency as a key part of how to think about fairness in hiring. In this next section, we'll get into the mechanics of how to create a consistent process. So let's talk about the most important anti-bias tool we'll discuss today, structured interviewing. It is the best tool in the fight against capriciousness in hiring, and it's the only approach validated time and again in academic research to reliably produce better hires and decrease the effect of bias in the interview process. A structured interview process is the set of answers to the questions: what needs to be true about this candidate to succeed in the role, and how will we evaluate each of those criteria? In practice, this means starting with thinking about what's important and turning those criteria into a scorecard, then figuring out what questions or tests would evaluate whether each of those criteria are true. By writing all this down, it becomes repeatable, so the interview can be conducted by anyone, and the candidate will have a consistent, mostly fair experience. Being explicit about criteria and questions doesn't eliminate subjectivity and therefore unfair differences in evaluation, but it does make things much more fair than they would if left up to each interviewer's favorite gotcha questions. In structured interviewing, your process will have decision points. Should this person be advanced? Interviews and assessments: does this person have the skills to do the job well? And a scorecard that gets progressively filled out by a whole team of people as they hire. Since this conference is filled with engineers, I'll make a technical analogy. Your interview process is a function that takes a collection of candidates and returns a hire, and the quality of what gets returned by this function rests on how carefully you design the algorithm. Designing a structured interview process requires a significant investment of time and energy to get right, but it produces better hires, hired more fairly. And there are two reasons not everyone does this. Number one, they might not be aware of this approach or their systems don't support it. And number two, it's a lot of work. To speak to that latter bit, it is a lot of work. But you know what's way worse than building interview plans? Building performance improvement plans, or winding up with the wrong person, or having to let someone go. It's awful for you as a manager, but it's way worse for the person you committed to bring on board who finds themselves suddenly jobless. It's not just a way to produce more fair outcomes to create a plan. It respects the gravity of the decision on the other person's life and on yours and on all of their team members to make a hire. A well-structured interview process tells you things you need to know about the hire across a bunch of different dimensions. Do they have the technical skill? Do they collaborate well? Do they want this job? Do they have strong written communication skills? We're testing different aspects of a person throughout the process, so it shouldn't be surprising that some interviewers rate a candidate differently than others. And as they were likely asking different questions, that meant that they were assessing different qualities. This image represents a parable called The Blind Men and the Elephant. Each feels a different part of the animal and describes it differently as a result. The one touching the leg thinks it's like a tree. The one touching the trunk thinks it's like a snake. And all of them are, of course, right, but each had a narrow perception of the whole. That will be true in interviewing as well. Interviewing is a team sport, and we must trust each other's assessments. And assessments become a lot more trustworthy when it's clear what's being assessed and how, making the who much less relevant. Lastly, on the topic of subjectivity, I want to note that getting a particularly harsh or particularly easy interviewer means that you may be more or less likely to get the job. All other biases set aside. We can't eliminate variability in subjective assessment completely, but there are two things that we can do to mitigate. Number one, more work. Set up a rubric by which to assess each criteria. What does good look like for each of the things we're trying to assess? And number two, look at interviewer calibration. For instance, inside of our own software, you can see how easy or harsh interviewers are, and perhaps use that as a grain of salt when considering their views. A critical aspect of fairness in hiring is also to eliminate the influence of factors which are irrelevant to a person's ability to succeed in the role. This means trying to level the playing field for as many of those relevant factors as possible. Might bad lighting or audio affect how a video interview goes? Some tips, maybe send some tips beforehand. Interviewing someone hearing impaired, be sure to turn on closed captioning in Zoom. What's your office dress code? Let the candidate know. I once showed up for a software engineering interview about 12 years ago in a 3-piece suit, and it felt weird to the whole team wearing t-shirts. The only silver bullet for inclusivity is thoughtfulness, actively thinking about how to eliminate irrelevant factors for the candidate. One final topic in interviewing I want to discuss is the role of funnel analysis and how it affects hiring outcomes across demographic groups. What you see here is actually a report stolen from Greenhouse that shows the pass-through rates of candidates from different racial and ethnic backgrounds from company X. As you can see, in this process, we see that the proportion of South Asian applicants progressing to hire is lower, and Latinx is higher as candidates progress through the hiring funnel. While there are more South Asian than Latinx candidates at the beginning of the process, by the higher stage, we see it as 4 times more likely that a Latinx person will be hired than a South Asian person. From the numbers on the left, we can see that the sample size is quite large. So something is going on here that is driving different outcomes. The hard work of fairness in hiring often comes down to how far we're willing to go to understand why. Fair offers. You've sourced hundreds of candidates, you've slogged through months of interviews, and you found them, the one. You go to make your offer and rejected. They took another offer with higher pay. Rejected. They took another offer with a more aligned mission. Rejected. They took a job with a better vacation policy. You did so much work to get to this stage, and now you're back at square one. Oops. Candidates evaluate the fairness of offers according to 3 different lenses. How does compensation compare to the market? How does the compensation in this offer compare to my current or last deal? And number 3, how do I value the intangibles like mission and benefits? For them to feel the offer is fair, they'd like it to be true that the company pays competitively with the market that they're in, and that they're paid as much or more than they were in their last role. But as a company, you can also give them other things they value, some of which they may value more than money. Great coworkers, flexible arrangements, a mission to believe in, and challenging work. These are all part of the value proposition that your company puts out there when you send an offer to a candidate. Though pay is critically important, it's not the whole picture. Revisiting a concept from earlier, the perception of fairness is about reducing envy when we compare our lot to others. Negotiation is part of arriving at a fair agreement between any 2 parties, ensuring each is satisfied with the arrangements before signing on the dotted line. But a fair deal between 2 parties may create systemic unfairness. This is no better highlighted than the presence of the gender wage gap. There is way too much going on here to explain in this talk. Entrenched gender roles, the professions chosen, inequity in childcare responsibilities, and the list goes on and on. But it has also been shown that men are more likely to negotiate than women. In a 2018 study published by Robert Half, 68% of men and 45% of women negotiated the terms of their offer. Men are 50% more likely, according to this study, to negotiate, and that's a big deal. If we assume negotiation makes it more likely you'll be paid more, then as a cohort, men are, based on this one difference, likely to be paid more than women. So how can we make negotiation more fair? 1, we can create clear bounds to a negotiation. What are the upper and lower limits? And create better equity across genders. An explicit offer to discuss terms and provide an opening allows candidates to have a conversation without feeling that they have to damage the relationship in the process. But the optimally fair strategy might actually be don't negotiate pay at all. That means paying enough to close the candidates you need without negotiating. Some might walk, but for those who do accept your offers, you'll know that your pay is consistent with what you believe about the market, not determined by a candidate's level of assertiveness. And for most roles, assertiveness is not what you are hiring for and is an irrelevant trait to pay extra for. That all said, we don't live in a perfect world where no one budges on offers and pays top of market. We're running real businesses, and that sometimes means negotiation. But we should be wary of how a reactive policy on negotiation creates disparate impact, as we may also contribute unwittingly to inequality by doing so. Last slide. All right, so wrap up and key takeaways. Thank you all for tolerating the audio issues earlier. Fairness is both complex and subjective. There's no right or wrong. That's super clear. Fairness and fair outcomes are not always the same thing. Sometimes they can be synergistic, and sometimes they're actually in tension. Fairness issues creep into the hiring process at every stage. So the real silver bullet is just to be mindful and think about it. As leaders, we are the hiring market, and together we can make hiring more fair. Thank you.